I see already hands asking a question. So Eric Sandner, please.
My real thought is that when you clarify the meaning of secular, I think that maybe it needs to remain a little bit messy, because I think that the secular stagnation, I think, has something to do with the stagnation of secularization. That is the kind of secularization that was converting religious values into value. The self-valorization of value. In other words, where, you know, when the religious dimension disappeared, and apparently, you know, from a seemingly secular society, I think Marx recognized that it moved into what seemed to be the most materialist of our activities, that is economy. And so the drive of self-valorization is, in a certain sense, where our religious lives, you know, were lived most intensively. And so the stagnation of that also, I think, could be something productive. That mode of secularization, which is not a secularization after all.
Yeah. So just a quick thing on the first question, because I feel maybe slightly more equipped to answer that one than the second, but I'll try to say something about your second question too. Yeah, so I mean, another interesting way to ask that question might have to do with mainstream economics, and particularly neoclassical economics, fetish for equilibrium, right? Which also seems like it allows for a kind of steady state or a kind of stasis, a useful stasis, a salutary stasis, right? But of course, the point of equilibrium theory is that the equilibrium is always getting bigger. The point of equilibrium is always increasing, basically, right? So the market itself, where the supply and demand meet its equilibrium, always has to keep growing. And I think that in that sense, I mean, I think that the idea that there could be a steady state economy that was also a capitalist economy, I just don't think that that makes any sense. I mean, I disagree with Mill, and I disagree with with the tradition of sort of more mainstream ecological economists across particularly the first half of the 20th century that would assert that. I mean, I think part of the strange thing about stagnation theory is that these mainstream guys like Summers, for instance, think that we could have this condition and that it would still be capitalism and that it won't devolve into violence. And I just don't think that's true. But I do think that the emerging theory of the internal limits to capitalism is coming back to that idea that those limits might be natural, but not in the kind of ontological sense that the way that the natural appears in the 19th century, but in a very literal one, right? Which is that we are in a point of the attenuation of the natural resources or the exhaustion of natural resources. I mean, I think probably the way that I think for me, the distinction between the cyclical and the terminal, and the way that the secular sort of sits uncomfortably between the two is important enough that I want that to be the kind of primary meaning of it, and that is what it means for the thinkers themselves, and this is in part an intellectual history. So I think I want to retain that, but I would say that maybe one way to think about it, and we didn't get to talk about this much in the talk, but the other form that anxiety about birth rate decline takes is the rise of the alt-right. And so this is particularly, the birth rate discourse is particularly prevalent in Europe. But there's this term that's used by white nationalist movements called demographic winter. And it's the idea that you have declining Anglo birth rates. Yeah. And there's lots of documentaries like on the right about this. So I think that one way to think about that, sort of the crisis of the secular, might also be to think about the ways in which demographic anxieties do tend to get articulated in a language of a certain kind of nationalist and ethnic identity that seems deeply at odds with, if also a kind of symptom of the collapse of the liberal state that has defined the sort of the epoch of capitalist expansion from the 19th to the end of the 20th century. So I think that would be like one way to take that sort of expanded sense of the secular and a crisis of the secular.
I think there was a question here, Suzanne.
Yes, maybe it's maybe a slightly sort of a follow-up from Eric's question, I'm not sure, but so I guess my question has to do with something that I would call like the economy of the figure in the way you were putting this argument forward. I mean, I was incredibly surprised by how much even, how much economics is just one big metaphor, and so, at one point you talk about the distinction between cause and figure. In other words, is this being used figuratively? Is this actually, a causal argument? And so I guess my question is, how do you think that through? Is from the proponents who are speaking, is that's kind of pronatal, these pronatalist metaphors to be understood metaphorically or not? And can they, do they themselves even reflect on that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
In a way, it's like what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to use it as an excuse to read these theories against themselves. Because I think I think demographic explanations for crisis and for economic slowdown typically are both, for one thing, they're pretty much wrong. Demographers themselves, population theorists themselves have said, look, there's no connection between population growth and the natural rate of interest. It's just bogus. So they don't seem very persuasive to me. Keynes himself vacillates wildly between the 20s, between 1925 and 1940 or so, as to whether overpopulation or underpopulation is the problem. He completely changes his mind. And often, that has to do with whether they're worried about inflation or deflation, and so there's a kind of phallic metaphor at work there, I think. So I don't think it's very empirically persuasive, and I also think that in general, I'm pretty persuaded by Cooper's argument, which is that it typically, and this continues to be the case, gets treated as an alibi for both this kind of fetish of the family, a kind of heteronormative fetish of the family in a way that often drives policy, and also tends to have some kind of ethno-nationalist anxiety written into it, right? Because for one thing, you could say if the problem in the U.S. were simply population decline, then why wouldn't we open our borders rather than close them, right? Just a banal, same thing in Europe, right? So I think in that sense, there's sort of nothing to be mined from it empirically. That causal explanation is either untrue or politically suspect or both. And so I think what I'm trying to do is use its figurativeness as an opportunity to kind of read it against itself, and a way to think about how to understand a certain kind of undercurrent of anxiety, even amongst a mainstream economic discourse that, and also to understand that the way that anxiety always appears when it gets figurative. Because I'm pulling out these moments, but in fact, my other project is on microeconomics, which is basically the mathematicization of economic discourse and the turn emphatically away from classical political economy's interdisciplinarity, right? Classical political economy, for all its faults, is interested in things like moral philosophy, for instance. It's interested in culture, it's interested in ethics, it's interested in politics. Mainstream economics is not as a discipline. And so by finding these moments where mainstream economics has to articulate itself in language, right, as opposed to numbers, so particularly these sort of statements of policy or these kind of more mainstream accounts, I'm interested in sort of saying, maybe you all are not quite so optimistic or confident as you appear, and also maybe your recourse to the figurative suggests something about what anxieties even you have about the state of capitalism.
We have two other questions here, and then Arjun.
Thank you so much. Both your contributions were extremely stimulating, and I love this project, so I just say it. Thank you. So, in the narrative of debt, there has always been a villain, as Keynes knew well, and this villain is inflation. And so I think there is a big challenge now if we want to go to that different narration that Keynes gave us, where inflation is something acceptable, that can be useful because basically transfers value from the indebted to the creditors. Or if we want also to have a critique of this other approach. And I think this is a decision that has to be made if we want our critique of the narrative of debt to be effective and to be also useful for this world. So if you had any thought about it, I would be extremely interested to listen to it. if you don't, please, let's think about it.
Yeah. Well, I don't have exactly, but it's true that it's difficulty we have just right now to think against debt and indebtedness. Oh, sorry. It's one of the difficulties. So we have to rethink the whole thing. The whole thing. I was impressed by the importance of metaphors just right now. It seems to me that there is first an ongoing battle of metaphors, and the question of growing interest in indebtedness, creditors, and inflation, and possibility of inflation. That's true that we forgot. Actually, in Europe, we are about to forget what inflation causes in societies. So it's quite easy to say that, yes, we don't want debts to be repaired and it's okay. And if inflation comes back, we may have another way of considering this the whole question of debt. But now I can see that, for example, in the question of slowing down, it's a kind, or liquidity, all the metaphors of liquidity, health, acceleration, or slowing down. It's very important in literature, of course, in literature of the debt, and of course in economic discourse. And there is a kind of, for example, the slowing down is meant to be a good thing in literature, you know. It's a kind of Bartlebism. I don't know if it can be Bartlebism. It's a kind of a default response, default posture, and slowing down against the social acceleration. It's meant to be a good thing. So it's interesting to hear that slowing down as a stagnation, it's the opposite of what we're meant to want. And now we are battling over metaphors, over temporality representations. And of course, inflation is a kind of representation of temporality we are about to forget, or we may forget, because we think it differently. So I don't have economic because I'm not an economist, and I'm sure Annie can answer.
No, but I was not asking for
Yeah, I know.
I was asking for a narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very, of course, like one of the things that is perplexing economists in the US particularly right now is how is it that you can have stagnation and not inflation? Because the sort of most recent US example of a period of stagnation was stagflation in the 70s, and there you had both, right, at the same time. They are accustomed to that. They're not really accustomed to what is happening now. I mean, I think the question of inflation is super interesting, I think, in a way, and the extent to which, because historically, of course, the inflation was understood as a transfer back to the debtor, right? But the creditors don't like it at all because it deflates the value of the debt that you hold. But of course, also, particularly in the 1980s, after Volcker and the Reagan administration raised interest rates, because of the extent to which working and middle-class people depend on consumer debt for things like mortgages, inflation is also it's not a great thing for the working class and middle class in that period either. So sort of neither inflation nor deflation works for the creditor class in a system where everybody has to undergo debt to survive pay for basic reproductive goods.
There was a question, Arjun.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for two splendid papers, presentations. And I have a comment which could also be taken as a question, but I'll say it's really a comment on each. And I'll start with my thought about Emmanuel's wonderful tour d'horizon of really remarkable literature, much of which I don't know, especially the novels, so I'm taking notes furiously with those names and books because they sound really terrific and important. But one thought I had in relation to the thread of your whole argument is, if you take that line which comes out of Morse's The Gift, in which debt, and people like Graeber have, footnotes to that line of thought, long footnote, of course, but still, I think coming out of Morse, that if debt belongs to the field of exchange, which is, and therefore of gift, as Morse wanted to think about it, there's an interesting thing, which is the Morsean view, which is also later in Bourdieu and so on, is that if you actually return fully, the relationship is over. So basically the whole point of reciprocal ongoing systems of relating is to keep it always open. Because if you settle too fast, settle too precisely, etc., you're saying goodbye. You don't want the relationship. So actually debt settlement in the Morsean view is fatal to sociality. Can't be there, really. The interesting thing is similar now in our financial economy. Nobody wants debts to be repaid. They have to be increased. There has to be debt upon debt at our level. And that is the lifeblood of the financial world. So settling debts is precisely deadly. It's undesirable. So both in the Morsean world of gift exchange and conscience collective and so on, but also in our completely brutal financialized world, both have one point of agreement. Debt should never be repaid. Axiomatically, somehow it has to be perpetual. So that's just an observation comment to see what you think. And with Annie's wonderful paper, which has a lot of things, again, that I didn't know much about in terms of the literature on reproduction and all the fascinating stuff. But going to your general line of argument about this kind of return of the specter of stagnation to people like Summers, I see two things, and I think they're connected. One is, I think, also part of Eric's question, which is what is the relationship of the entire history of this, what we might argue is the central idea of neoclassical economics, which you also mentioned, equilibrium, and stagnation. Is stagnation simply equilibrium that's gone on too long, or something like that? Because they're clearly related. And I think that issue of what equilibrium means in neoclassical economics as a field which is born entirely out of the, let's say, modern economy is its biggest problem. Because they know capitalism is a growth machine, and yet their central concept is about how we will get to that little one instant when there's equilibrium. So you get Debreu and all the thousands of people, the early Stieglitz, they're all on and on about equilibrium. They can't let it go. But my other idea about, so my first thought is there's some fundamental antinomy in neoclassical, in which these ideas and what they can never be resolved. But when I look for an answer to why they, even today, stay in this set of interactive terms, is because they don't pay attention to finance as a field which is basically completely independent. People doing finance, which of course the economists think is not economics, is something applied, of course totally untrue, it's highly theorized, have zero interest in supply and demand, limited resources, nation. It's pure growth. And furthermore, it's applied, it's real. It generates actual wealth. So we know it's not some notion somewhere. And the whole lot of our current neoclassical mainstream, and even not so mainstream, I heard this from Stieglitz the other day, just have no idea. It's run away from them. So the entire central mechanism of wealth production in the last 40 years is outside the grasp of economics as discipline. So I think it would be helpful and interesting for you to consider that as one of the breakaway of finance, the fact that finance as a discipline and a practice now defines the world in a way that these ideas simply can't even begin to grasp, accounts for a lot of this kind of dead-end equality in mainstream economics. So anyway, that's just a thought, comment, proposal. But thank you both for terrific papers.
I think, sorry,
No.
go ahead.
Or I leave the comment on your comment to Peter, because I'm sure it's going to be back to Mauss and Derrida's.
Maybe, I don't know,
arguments.
I'm not sure. Annie, you wanted to?
Yeah, so I'll just say two things. One is that the Summers has this idea that has to do with equilibrium called, that he borrows from the biological sciences called hysteresis. And hysteresis is the idea in the biological sciences that an effect that the equilibrium remembers affects disturbances in it. So for Summers, the anxiety is that the new equilibrium that this economy maintains remembers its own disturbances, and that it thus sort of cycles back on itself, so that it can't actually improve fully, because at each stage the equilibrium starts to get smaller and lower rather than greater, right? But it's interesting to me the way that he gets this idea from the biological sciences. It's clearly part of this longer tradition. I think actually, like, yeah. No, it's okay.
What part of Summers' thing comes out of this kind of biological idea?
Hysteresis. Hysteresis. He uses the term. Yeah. So, yeah. So they're talking about, right, like the zero lower bound. Like, what do you do when you've reduced interest rates to effectively zero and you still don't have meaningful economic growth? So he explains that by virtue of this idea of hysteresis, which is that the effect becomes a cause, basically. And I think actually, though, your question about the sort of separation of finance from the rest of the economy as well as from the discipline of economics actually also relates to your question about not repaying, that the repayment of the debts would sort of create a catastrophe in the system. And I think in a way, like, I would maybe disagree a little bit, which is to say that part of the reason that I became interested in 2008 in particular is that initially when I was working on financialization, when I was doing a dissertation on it as a graduate student, I was really interested in this kind of like the separation of it, its existence as a kind of immaterial, an immaterial world that existed above the level of actual material economic transactions. But what seemed to me so important about the crisis of 2008, and what does seem to me important still about Marxist crisis theory, is that they do in the end have to be, some of them do in the end have to be repaid. That if people are not paying their mortgages, it doesn't matter how complex your financial instrument derived from mortgages is, if people aren't paying them, that instrument is going to collapse, right? And so one of the things that's interesting about what Summers is saying is that Summers and other economists like him are basically saying, like, this stock market bubble is just a bubble, and we cannot sustain U.S. economic growth. In fact, we have not, demonstrably, have not sustained U.S. economic growth. You look at GDP, right? Like, they're now downgrading GDP. Every quarter, we're downgrading GDP. We're now below 2%, right? Which is not sustainable as a model of economic growth, at least in terms of what we've had in the past. So what they're sort of saying is, like, the stock market bubble is not going to keep us going. And similar to what happened in 2008, if those obligations can't be repaid, it is going to collapse, right? And so, and I think the reason for me that Marxist crisis theory is important is that Marxist crisis theory says that, like, what I describe as like the MC ... M prime that credit makes possible, that sort of extension, that deferral of value production can happen for a bit, but eventually everything snaps back, right? And eventually, if you don't have the production of value occurring within the material economy, that immaterial economy, that sort of shadow economy that is finance will indeed collapse. So I think that's why it's interesting to me that, like, mainstream economists like Summers are basically saying a version of that themselves. Their account of it isn't mine, but I think it's interesting that they're saying it.
I think we'll take the time for a last question. Odette.
So just second, third, fourth, all of the comments, this is just amazing talks. I really enjoyed them and learned a ton. So I wanted to ask of both of you, and maybe this is just sort of a question to the room in general, about your views, or if you had a chance to sort of think about the recharacterization of macroeconomics that's going on in a lot of the finance through modern monetary theory. So MMT, I don't know if everyone is familiar with this, but sort of rethinking about the nature of money itself and the relationship of money and the creation of money to the government. And this is a big sort of rethink, and I mean, it really is very explicitly a re-narration of macroeconomics, especially in the US, that is led, at least in part, by, for example, one of the chief economic advisors to Bernie Sanders. So it's really a thing that is out there, that has gotten people very worked up, and that is very much, I think, linked to ideas of narrating the economy, narrating the national debt, narrating the possibilities of printing money to deal with the debt of others. And it seems like it would be ripe for the type of analysis that you're doing, and I wonder if you have seen that, thought about doing that, have thoughts about that whole re-narration of macroeconomics that's going on right now?
I can recommend a really good book on it that is doing it from the perspective of culture. It's new. I can't remember the title, but the author is Scott Ferguson, and it's from University of Nevada's Provocation series, and he's basically done exactly that. He's using MMT to rethink both 20th century economics and economic culture. I mean, I think it's really interesting that I think it as a sort of, I don't know that I find it very persuasive as a theory, but I do find it super interesting as an account. It feels to me like the way that it gets discussed by Bernie's team, for instance, feels to me so, it's so Grayberian. Like, it seems so much a part of that particular understanding of money as a kind of circulating fiction, and also of the way that it seems like it's a kind of an attempt to rethink the way that we have understood conversations in the United States about like the debt ceiling and national debt in ways that I think are certainly like super politically useful. I mean, I think as a way of expanding our terrain of possibilities, like for instance, as a way of talking about like, is free college in fact an impossibility, like a rational impossibility, and the way that MMT is being used to say like, no, it's not, I find it very persuasive. Other times, like some of the sort of economics of the Green New Deal, for instance, I find not particularly persuasive. And that's where I think I would come back to the idea that like you can't in fact have an ecological economic system that is also a capitalist one. Like I don't find that version of it persuasive. And the sort of short-term policy proposals that it has produced, I think seem like totally to the good.
So I think we'll take a short coffee break, but I just wanted to make a short comment myself on your two papers, and thank you very much. They were really thought-provoking. I was thinking of the way, Emmanuel, you equated in many ways debt and narrative, talking about Ulysses, Homer, and in a way you turned the expression debt narrative almost into a pleonastic expression. And so by contrast, I was thinking about what you did, Annie, in your attempt to offer a narrative of stagnation. And I was thinking that from the perspective of this pleonastic relation between debt and narrative, a narrative of stagnation almost seems an impossibility.
Not a narrative at all.
So doesn't narrative necessarily imply a progression, a temporal progression, a teleological direction of sorts? And so I was really interested in this contrast between your two papers. It's not really a question, it's a comment and an echo, so you don't have to answer. So thank you both very much.